Today's lesson is Food Protectionism Worsens Global Food Crisis. Hi everyone, I'm Mike.
And I'm Candice.
And today we are talking about something that, if you haven't been paying attention to the news, you might still have noticed after your recent trip to the supermarket. Things are getting expensive out there.
Not only expensive, but scarce. And I suppose the price is being driven up because of the scarcity, which means there are fewer of certain items available in the supermarket. In today's globalized society, where everybody depends on each other, we really need other countries to fill in the gaps in our supplies. So some countries have a lot of land to grow food, to produce food, whereas other smaller countries like Taiwan, for instance, we depend on imported food from other countries.
True.
So, of course, if there is a supply chain issue or if there is a limited stock coming from those countries, we're going to find ourselves in some serious difficulties.
Well, we often use the term a perfect storm to talk about all these different bad things that happen at the same time to create a really big problem. And we're kind of in that now, right? We have the war in Ukraine, where a lot of food comes from. And then, of course, the world is kind of waking up after the COVID pandemic, after things were locked down and getting things shipped around the world is getting challenging. Finding workers to do jobs is hard too. So a lot of these things are working all together to make food and getting food to the people who need it into a serious issue. So let's look at the first part of our article, and then we'll come back to talk about it. Food protectionism worsens global food crisis. With the prices of agricultural products having risen to unprecedented levels, many food-producing nations are limiting exports in order to protect their own supplies and prevent local prices from spiraling further out of control.
大家好，第一部分我们看到单字 worsen， 这个字是动词，指变糟或是使恶化。举例来说 ，The new operating system actually worsened the computer's performance。新的作业系统实际上恶化了电脑的性能。也可以说 ，As his health problems worsened, Zach had to resign his job。随着身体问题的恶化 ，Zach 不得不辞职。另外补充这个字的形容词 worse，W-O-R-S-E worse， 指更糟的。例如 I wasn't wearing a coat on the cold day, and to make matters worse, it began to rain. 天冷时我没有穿外套，更糟的是开始下起雨来了。或者 Helen got laid off. What's worse, her car just got stolen. Helen 被解雇了，更糟的是她的车子才刚被偷。接着我们看到形容词 unprecedented， 这个字的意思是空前的或是史无前例的，像是 The company made unprecedented losses last year， 该公司去年出现空前的亏损。或是 The Olympic athletes' consecutive gold medal wins were unprecedented， 那名奥运运动员连续夺得金牌的表现史无前例。另外补充相关单字 precedent，P-R-E-C-E-D-E-N-T precedent， 这个字是名词，它的意思是前例或是先例。例如 Critics believe that changes to police powers of arrest have set a dangerous precedent。 批评者认为警察逮捕权力的改变开创了一个危险的前例。也可以说 Helen's great invention sets a precedent for a more progressive society。 Helen 的伟大发明开启了社会更加进步的先例。
Well, here the first sentence read, with the prices of agricultural products having risen to unprecedented levels, many food-producing nations are limiting exports. When we talk about agricultural, we're referring to anything that grows on the land. So things that grow in the earth or animals that we produce for eating. In other words, more commonly known as farming. So when the prices of all these agricultural products rise, it becomes more and more difficult to make certain byproducts, make different kinds of food. So, for example, from wheat, we usually make flour, and from flour, we make bread. So if there is no wheat, we might have a shortage of bread. And these prices have risen to unprecedented levels. Precedent means that it's happened before. So when we look at the word precedent, it's a noun. It happened before. Unprecedented is the adjective, meaning that we've never seen anything like it. We haven't seen levels like the prices that we're seeing currently.
Absolutely. Something unprecedented could also be something that's absolutely never seen before. But here, of course, we've seen food shortages before. We've seen high prices before, but not to this level. So it is something that's never happened either ever in history or certainly not to this amount in history. So many food-producing nations are limiting exports in order to protect their own supplies and prevent local prices from spiraling further out of control. Well, this is a very human problem, isn't it? When you have something and you're not sure you have enough, but you're okay for now, and suddenly someone who doesn't have it says, "Can I have some?" You start to worry, well, if I give them what I have or even half of what I have, what am I going to do in the future? It's a very human thing to do. I mean, we do it. If your friend asks you to borrow some money and you're worried a little bit about your own money, it might be hard to lend that friend some money. And countries do it too on a huge scale with a food in terms of limiting exports. Now, exports are things that the country produces and then sends or ships or transports out of the country to other markets to sell things. Taiwan, of course, exports things like pineapples and those really cute little bananas that they export to Japan. People in Japan love those tiny little cute bananas. And of course, we're also famous for exporting a lot of microchips all around the world. These are things made or grown in Taiwan, either in a factory or naturally on a farm, and then shipped off, sent around the world to be sold in other markets in other areas. By limiting exports, you're saying, we're not going to send so much these days. We're going to keep a little bit more than normal. We're afraid. We want to protect our own supplies and prevent local prices from spiraling further out of control. When prices spiral further out of control, that's a word that you might have heard a lot in the news recently. That is inflation. When prices are rising and people, of course, if they're still making the same amount of money as before, everything becomes a lot more expensive.
Yeah, I usually think about spiraling out of control. When I think of the word spiral, I think of something like a natural disaster, like a tornado.
That's a big spiral of wind, right?
That's right. Yeah. And the spiral goes in a circular motion and either up or down, and it's got a central point. So in this case, prices are spiraling. So they're going from a central point and they're moving outward. And when something spirals out of control, it means that there isn't really any way to predict in what direction that spiral's going to go. The circles might get smaller, might get bigger, probably get bigger. But what is true is that once they go out of control, things become very unpredictable and prices of goods become very high. Things become expensive, especially basic items like staple foods become hard to buy.
That's exactly right. And we're going to find out some of the reasons why these prices are spiraling out of control in the next part of our article. So let's read that now. One reason for rising food prices is the war in Ukraine. Together, Russia and Ukraine account for nearly 30% of global wheat exports, and the two countries are key suppliers of other agricultural products, including barley, corn, and sunflower oil. The war has disrupted food production and cut off international shipments, exacerbating the effects of COVID-related supply chain issues. This decreased supply of agricultural products has caused a vicious cycle of food protectionism and global price increases. Among the nations that have cut export quotas are India, which has banned wheat exports, and Indonesia, which has restricted sales of palm oil.
第二部分我们看到单字 disrupt， 这个字是动词，表示使中断、打断或是搅乱。举例来说 ，Production has been disrupted because the workers have gone on strike。由于员工发动罢工，生产中断了。或是 The boisterous student disrupted the class。那名喧闹的学生打断了上课。另外补充这个字的名词 disruption。disruption 指中断或是扰乱，像是 There were disruptions to the subway system this morning. 今天早上地铁系统出现了中断。或是 A high turnover in personnel can result in the disruption of a business. 人员流动率高可能会导致业务中断。接着我们看到名词 quota， 表示限额、定量或是配额。例如 Some believe traffic police have a quota of speeding tickets to issue. 有些人认为交通警察有限额的在开超速罚单。也可以说 The company has a monthly quota for employees' lunches. 这家公司每个月有员工午餐配额。
All right, it's time to dial down and get to some of the facts about exactly why food prices around the world are going crazy and also why it's leading to food shortages in certain parts of the world. One reason for rising food prices is the war in Ukraine. I don't think this is news for anyone who's been paying attention for the last 6 months. Big war in Ukraine, Russia invaded, and Ukraine is a huge wheat producer. A lot of the wheat sold, especially in Africa and third world countries, comes from Ukraine. With a war going on, it's hard to get that grain, that wheat, out of the country.
Together, Russia and Ukraine account for nearly 30% of global wheat exports,
Wow.
the article goes on to say. And the two countries are key suppliers of other agricultural products, including barley, corn, and sunflower oil. So those are some very important staples in most countries around the world. And 30% is quite a big chunk of the pie. When we talk about accounting for, it makes up, it composes, or it's responsible for that. So when they limit their exports, that means that it has a big effect on the countries that rely on those exports to feed their citizens.
We're talking about, a smaller amount out of a larger grouping. And key suppliers, someone who makes something, a company or country, could be a supplier. As I mentioned earlier, Taiwan is a key supplier of microchips around the world. They're made here and then sold all over the place. So barley, corn, sunflower, these things are important for people. And I'm sure a lot of that barley and corn is also used to feed chickens and pigs and animals on farms and stuff like that. So the price of everything goes up, not just your bread, but your bacon as well. The war has disrupted food production and cut off international shipments, exacerbating the effects of COVID-related supply chain issues. Yeah, this is getting into that perfect storm of bad situations that I talked about. When we disrupt something, that's kind of like interrupting. You're stopping normal service. You're causing some kind of problem. A power failure will disrupt the MRT system. A strong storm might disrupt the flight schedule at the airlines. They have to stop planes, cancel planes, reroute planes, delay things. So things just don't run and flow and go as smoothly as they should normally. And food production has been disrupted. Of course, farmers can't farm when bombs and tanks are fighting all around them. And it's also cut off international shipments. Earlier, we had that word export. When you export something, I should say, or when you have an export, you have to send it to places. That act of sending is a shipment, okay? You can send it by the post office or UPS, FedEx, something like that. Or, of course, also when we're thinking of those really big boats that carry containers or gasoline or other types of resources around the world, those are the shipments that we're kind of talking about.
That's right. Moving on to the next sentence. This decreased supply of agricultural products has caused a vicious cycle of food protectionism and global price increases. Now, when we get into a vicious cycle, it means that one problem leads to another problem, which makes the first problem worse.
Which makes the second problem worse.
And so it keeps on going, right?
Yeah.
It just goes around in a circle all the time.
I've actually heard that term vicious circle too.
That's right.
Yeah.
So they're interchangeably
Right.
used, vicious cycle and vicious circle. So the problem of global price increases is really being made worse by food protectionism, because by holding on to the supply, prices all around the world are increasing.
Exactly. And as they increase somewhere else, they increase in other places. And that, of course, leads to an increase back in the original place. And that's the vicious cycle. It's kind of a negative spiral that you can't break out of. That's the other idea with a vicious cycle. It's hard to stop this thing from continually happening and getting worse at the same time. So it's not just in the Ukraine. It says among the nations that have cut export quotas are India, which has banned wheat exports, and Indonesia, which has restricted sales of palm oil. I think we've also seen some of the effects in Sri Lanka, right, which just had a huge political crisis, and part of the reason was they couldn't get food. I'm sure they used to import a lot of food from India, but if India has banned wheat exports, that means their neighboring countries or their customers around the world who used to buy Indian wheat, they can't buy it anymore because India isn't selling it. It's a government policy. They've stopped it using legal government means. That's what we mean here by banning something. Well, you might ban you from getting on an airplane without a COVID vaccine, or getting on an MRT without wearing a mask, or ban people from smoking near a hospital. It's kind of a legal rule that basically says you can't do something. We're stopping you from doing this because of the bad consequences of it. All right, so let's look at the third part of our article right now. As this hoarding behavior increases, food staples have become unaffordable for many, especially those in developing nations. Yet, even though a hike in food prices is most devastating for the world's poorest people, no one is immune. At this stage, it seems as though only a breakthrough in the war or a joint agreement by food-producing nations will ease the situation.
第三部分我们看到单字 unaffordable， 这个字是形容词，指负担不起的或是无法支付的，像是 College tuitions have become unaffordable to many families。 大学学费对许多家庭而言已经变得负担不起了。或者 The expensive rent in this area is unaffordable for many people。 这一地区昂贵的房租令许多人负担不起。最后我们看到形容词 devastating， 表示毁灭性的、破坏力极大的意思。例如 The construction of the new railway has had a devastating effect on wildlife。 那条新铁路的兴建对野生动物有毁灭性的影响。也可以说 The damage from the typhoon was devastating to the community。 那个台风对该社区带来重大灾情。
So, when countries can't get what they want and certain countries are afraid of giving away too much of what they have, this can lead to a behavior called hoarding. And as we see in the next sentence, as this hoarding behavior increases, food staples have become unaffordable for many, especially those in developing nations. Sure, the countries that produce a lot can just hold on to what they produce, but what about the countries that have lots of people but very few farms, can't produce a lot of their own food? Well, these food staples staples become unaffordable. When you're hoarding something, you're holding on to it. You're afraid you're not going to be able to get it. You're not giving it away. You're saying, no, I've got this and don't come near me. I'm keeping this because I'm afraid I won't have it in the future. Good luck to you, but don't come asking to me because I'm not giving it away. And especially in terms of staples. A staple is basically the most common food that is eaten in that society. When we think of staples in terms of global food, we're usually thinking of grain. So rice would be a staple for most of East Asia. Wheat would be a staple for most of Europe and North America. Corn might be a staple in South America and parts of Africa. This is the kind of food that people eat probably with every meal. And if it becomes unaffordable, if it becomes too expensive, well, people, especially poor people, we're probably going to have a problem getting enough food to eat. If something's unaffordable, you can't afford it. You don't have enough money for it. It won't fit in your budget, most likely because the price is too high, either because it's just expensive or because the supplies are very limited. But basically, your budget can't stretch to pay for that product or that thing.
Yeah, and as Mike said, the next sentence goes on, yet even though a hike in food prices is most devastating for the world's poorest people, no one is immune. So devastating is the adjective of to devastate, which means to cause great damage or harm. So if something is devastating, it's hurtful, it's painful, it hurts you in some way. And it is devastating, it really hurts the lives of the poorest people. But when no one is immune, it means that nobody is spared. It means everybody is affected by it. So if you're immune, usually you have some kind of protection. This sentence suggests that nobody is going to have enough protection because somehow this problem will touch their lives.
So how are we going to get out of this problem? Well, the final little paragraph sentence says, at this stage, it seems as though only a breakthrough in the war or a joint agreement by food-producing nations will ease the situation. Well, that's not exactly great news because it seems as though only. When we say it seems as though only, we're kind of saying there really aren't many options here. There's probably only one or two. They're probably not great options. We need some luck or some new ideas or something because right now there are no easy solutions. What would be a solution? Well, a breakthrough in the war. Yeah, if Vladimir Putin said, all right, this was a terrible idea. I'm sorry, I'm bringing all my soldiers back, and the war ended, that would be great for everyone. That would be a wonderful breakthrough. So a breakthrough is finding a solution to a probably difficult problem you've been dealing with for a long time. So if we could get the war to end or have food-producing nations, other countries like India, America, places like that, agree to share their food a little more fairly, that would help. But both of those are not easy answers, not easy to achieve answers for this problem. All right, now it's time to go over to our Chinese teacher. So let's listen to her and we'll be back with our discussion starter.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文一开始提到，随着农产品价格上涨到前所未有的程度，许多粮食生产国正在限制出口来保护自己的供给量，并防止当地价格进一步急剧失控。好，那文中它是用到 unprecedented 来形容前所未有的。那它的字首 un 这个部分呢，它有表达这种不无或是相反的意思。那 unprecedented 这个字呢，是来自动词 precede， 我们就来学习它的字首字根。当你看到 CESS、CEED、CEDE 这一类的字根呢，它们就有go 的意思，也就是前进啊，行走。那它也可以表达退让、投降或放弃的意思。那么在 precede 这个字当中，它的字首 pre 表示事先或是在点点点之前。那么字根 cede 的部分表示行进。我们把两个部分组合在一起，字面意思是走在点点点之前。那 precede 这个动词就是用来表达处在点点点之前，先于什么什么。我们接着在precede 后面加上名词字尾 ent 变成 precedent， 那就表示先例、 前例，像我们说 set a precedent 表示开了一个先例， break with precedent 表示破例或是打破先例的意思。我们接着在这个 precedent 前面再加上否定字首 un， 然后把字尾加上 ed， 就会得到 unprecedented， 那它就是表达前所未见的、空前的、史无前例的。我们顺便补充几个有这一类字根的单字。第一个是 proceed， 它的字首 pro 表示 forward 向前，那么 ceed 表示 go， 合在一起 proceed 就表示 go forward， 那就是朝着什么前进，它也带有这种继续做某事啊、继续进行的意思。第二个补充的是 recession， 它的字首 re 表示 back 向后，那么字根 cess 表示 go 行进行走，还有 ion 是名词字尾。我们向后走就是倒退嘛，那么 recession 它就有倒退、退去的意思。这个字也常常用来表达经济衰退啊、不景气等等。好，我们的文中它有用到 prevent local prices from spiraling further out of control 来表达防止当地的价格进一步急剧失控。我们这边补充了两个重点，第一个是prevent 受词 from 再加动词 ing 可以表达阻止某人做某事啊，防止某事物点点点。那么动词 prevent 在这边就有防止、制止的意思，我们也可以把它换成 stop 或者是 keep。好，那看个例句哦。Negative thoughts can prevent us from achieving our goals。负面想法可能会阻止我们达成目标。那第二个补充的重点是 spiral， 它当动词，它可以表达急剧增长，像是可能费用啊、价格、数量等等急剧增长。那它也可以表达呈螺旋式的上升或是下降，或者是用来描述这个形势急剧恶化。那我们这边用 spiral out of control 是指急剧失控的意思。举例来说 ，We need to take action before things spiral out of control。我们得在情况失控之前采取行动。好，以上是今天重点整理，我们回顾今天的单字吧。
Agricultural. John moved west and bought a large plot of agricultural land. Unprecedented. Inflation has risen to unprecedented levels in many countries. Disrupt. Our travel plans were disrupted by the typhoon. Quota. Those countries have imposed strict fishing quotas to prevent overfishing. Ban. Smoking is banned in and around the school grounds. Immune. She tries not to let their comments affect her, but she's not immune to criticism. Breakthrough. The two countries achieved a breakthrough in their peace talks.
Discussion Starter starts now!
And our discussion starter for this article, do you think limiting exports is a good response to the rise in global food prices? Why or why not?
Well, I do think it's reasonable for countries to limit food exports since they have a duty to feed their citizens first. And for example, in the case of Ukraine, if they continue to export food staples like wheat and oats, it may lead to food shortages and starvation in their own country. And that would be absolutely disastrous while it's at war with Russia and especially with winter coming.
That's very true, but I would say if countries limit food exports, then that could lead to starvation in other parts of the world, people dying of hunger. For this reason, I think that the rich countries that have more than they need should by law be forced to send it to other countries. That would be horrible if people really suffered badly because of this problem. Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Mike.
I'm Candice.
See you next time.